Hi, welcome back to my garden. Once upon a time, when I was still at university, I went through a terrible but fascinating experience. It was the end of the semester. The exams were over, and a bunch of us were in the residence pub celebrating, or at least commiserating, or just blowing off steam. The night before we were due to head back, a bunch of us in a friend's car from Cape Town to Port Elizabeth. It was a great evening, and the next day, somewhat bleary-eyed, we made our way to the car and off we went. The two drivers were in the front seat. I didn't do any driving back then or ever since, and perhaps this story has something to do with that. At any rate, when we're nearly in Port Elizabeth, sort of on the outskirts, the driver sort of nodded off and drifted from the fast lane into the central reservation, where there was a bit of gravel. And when that happened, he kind of startled, perked up, and pulled back maybe a bit too sharply onto the road, at which point he blew a tyre, and we went veering off, careening off the road, probably doing 140 kilometers an hour, flying off the other side where there was a bit of a ditch, and eventually made impact. Car was an absolute write-off. Amazingly, the three of us all got out of it unscathed, although initially we were quite astonished to see how far away the back windscreen had been hurled, for example, and trying to work out what was going on, where our possessions were, what had happened to us. We pieced it all together afterwards, but I'm sort of dragging out the story because that's not the point. Sometime later, when I thought back on this experience, I mean, there's obviously one of the takeaways is, thank God I'm alive, and I probably shouldn't do that again. Even if in my case, it was a passive role. I should probably only get into cars when people are wide awake and not on the back end of a skinful of post-examination lager. There was something else that kind of struck me at the time when I sort of played over the whole situation in my mind. And that was how, for some time, it was all in slow motion and a silent movie. Sort of time slowed down, and I kind of became hyper aware, it seemed to me on reflection, of the visual, physical stimuli, what was happening in the car. And I realized at a time that there was kind of no sound. And a bit later on, another friend who was at university was involved in a car crash. He said something, and this is actually kind of what jogged back that memory. He said at the time that it was incredible. He'd been in this car crash, and while he was just kind of like sitting in his car, trying to kind of piece it all together and work out what had happened, the car was silent, and then suddenly sound sort of kicked back in. But he hadn't been aware of it for a few minutes. And I'm sort of mentioning all this because it sort of came back to me when I was thinking about something related this last week or so. I mean, I guess what happens in those situations is in cases of exceptionally high stress, your body releases hormones, and you pay attention to what matters. But I don't think situations of high stress are simply something where there's an on-off switch. And perhaps one of the takeaways for me from that is that our perceptions are very much coloured by everything else that's going on around us. And consequently, they're not really that accurate. I mean, we know this anyway because neuroscience seems to tell us that we are flooded with hundreds of thousands of bits of information every second, and we can pay attention to hundreds of them rather than hundreds of thousands. And so all that information's coming in, but we're only really conscious of a very minuscule portion. And when we try and put together some kind of narrative of what's going on, it's consequently, as much as it might be based on, in some sense, real things, it's very subjective to what we're paying attention to. In the situation of a car crash, obviously that subjectivity is heightened and heavily distorted. But then when I was thinking about this, and quite why I was, I'm not sure. I think I'm sort of putting this together in reverse. It strikes me that consequently our reasoning is equally subjective. And I've been thinking about this, and that's really where all this came from. Thinking about this lately, one of the things that makes me aware of this is that when I'm solving my chess puzzles in the morning, my success is somewhat hit and miss. But to what extent is that dependent on the problems themselves? And to what extent is it dependent on the frame of mind I bring to bear? Indeed, a grandmaster has spoken about this in one of his courses on a fantastic learning platform, Chessmood. Grandmaster Avatek, one of his big tips for avoiding blundering in chess games is only play when you're in the right mood. It will make a big difference. And if you're not in the right mood and you have to play, develop routines to get yourself into the right mood. And if that's true of chess decisions, well, it's true of all our other myriad decisions that we make throughout the day. And if it's true of the things that we perceive, when we're in heightened states, for example, in a car crash, it's on a much more gentle scale true of what we're perceiving when we're in other situations. Now, how far we can push all of this and suggest that reality is just internally constructed, and any pretense at some kind of objective external reality, whether it exists or not, is basically doomed to failure because, the way we are perceiving that objective reality, the way we're thinking about it, and based on those perceptions and thoughts, the actions we end up taking are heavily distorted by what we're bringing to bear when we go into the situation, or what external pressures are being imposed upon us. And I was thinking about this again this week because I have an exhibition coming up, and I get, I have to say, unnecessarily tense when I have these sorts of events. I unnecessarily tense, not because the things that I'm worried about or imagining aren't in some sense real, but unnecessarily because they always turn out well, however they turn out. The worst thing that happens, somehow it is sort outable. You can move yourself forward and things will be okay. So why all that tension? Especially as that tension certainly doesn't help me perform better. And I was struck a few days ago by a strange sort of incident where I started thinking, well, to what extent is that interacting with things well beyond what I imagine it might? For example, because that was a bit of a word salad and bit of muddled thinking. My cat bit me. Now, apparently cats do that. He's a male cat, and maybe when he's stressed out, there's a female cat on heat or some sort of territorial dispute. I don't know. I don't know that much about cats. Never intended to get a cat. But the cat got us. It was a sort of stray that made its home in my workshop, and that's that. And most of the time, he's quite playful. He's in his second year. And the little nips are just interpreted as playfulness. But this wasn't playfulness. This was a full-blown draw-blood bite. Not pleasant at all. And I thought, well, you know, what's going on in the cat's world? But I was pretty angry. And then a few days later, and as these other, you know, the tension of the impending exhibition built up, it struck me that perhaps the fact that I've had lots of people visiting, lots of things going on, that perhaps those sort of stresses and strains mark me in a way that I'm not fully aware of, that I don't really notice, but the cat does. Maybe the cat was feeling stressed out, perceived that I was feeling stressed out, and it became a bit of a cat fight. Don't know how that comes across, but you know what I mean. That it's these sort of, the way we're feeling starts rippling out, and the way other things are imposing upon us starts to interact, and things happen. And if we can simply calm down, take a deep breath, and react with the world in a sort of more neutral way, things will work out much better. I mean, quite what brought on this chain of thought? It was these sorts of events. It was, of course, once again the fact that as this month has hurtled towards its conclusion and stuff is being happening, and I really haven't had a sort of solid routine for a few months now. Perhaps it's all kind of coming together. But it did strike me that, you know, we look at these things and we can see how they affect our lives when they're big and bold and technicolor, violent interruptions like a car accident. But as I say, I suspect that we need to look at these things as just a multitude of events on an enormous continuum of our daily experiences. And even when they are much more gentle, they're still having a slight impact. And the more we can pull ourselves back when we think, when we observe, when we react, and just do things in a more sort of mindful, dispassionate way, probably the better our decisions will be. And when we are feeling that the world is hitting us like a bit of a car crash, that things are in a bit of a whirlwind, if we just sit quietly and calmly and let everything settle, perhaps we will see things more clearly, that things aren't necessarily quite as bad, or even if they are as bad as we imagine, that feeling, that sort of embracing that bad isn't going to help us think more clearly and work out what the best next step forward is. And it will certainly impact on what ripples out beyond that. Well, there we are. That was a bit of a long one. Not sure how much sense it made. I never am. Let me know what you think. Trust your lives are filled with joy. And until next week, from sunny Brazil.